All right, dude.
All right, man. Well, we're recording. Here we go. Let me introduce my friend Dwight Radcliff. So I'll start with the professional stuff, and then I'll tell how I actually know you. Okay.
Oh God.
So,
Okay. This should be fun.
all right. So Dwight is first off, he's a pastor. He is a church planter in our neighboring city of Gardena, and that's actually how I came to know you, is in church planter land, and specifically
Yeah.
at Fuller. Yeah. So Dwight is a professor at Fuller, and your title is so long, I have to read it, brother. It's that good.
And it just changed.
Oh, it did. Maybe you should tell me, what's your new title?
So all of us that are running the ethnic centers, the Asian American Center, Korean Center, Central Latino, and the Pinnell Center for Black Church Studies. We were hitherto called assistant provosts.
Yes.
But Fuller has moved away from the provostial model. So the question was, how do you have an assistant provost and you don't have a provost? So I believe now we are going with academic dean of.
Ooh, I like that even better. I like so. Okay, so you're now the academic dean of the William E. Pinnell Center for African American Church Studies.
Yeah.
I like it. I like it a lot.
I just try to show up and do my job, dude.
Well, yeah. Well, and you do it well. So, all right. So Dwight and I. So here's how we met. So Fuller, a handful of years ago, started this church planting program, church planting initiative, and they invited a handful of us that they wanted to be founding faculty members to go on a retreat. And so that's where Dwight and I first connected, was doing the monk thing at a retreat center out in the foothills.
Yeah.
And since that time, so I think folks will understand what I mean by this. But one of the things I've really appreciated in my friendship with you, Dwight, is you're one of a handful of people that, as I've been learning and growing, one of those people that I can show up at your office and I can plop down on your couch and say, "Is it okay if I ask you a couple of dumb white guy questions?" And you're so generous with that, and seriously, it's been so helpful. And your own experience, and then just your knowledge. You did your doctorate in this area. You personally and academically, this is where you live. So one more personal thing, and then I'll stop talking. But so on sabbatical last summer, my family and I got to visit your church.
That's right.
And we had so much fun. It was such a great experience. And
awesome.
And for my kids, so we were able to visit a good number of friends' churches last summer, but yours was the favorite. People loved it. There was no warmer church. I swear every person there hugged us. And it was
that's about right. Pre-COVID.
Seriously. Yeah, that's right. That's right. And that kind of exemplified the church. I mean, every way. It was just warm and, just a beautiful worship service. And, you preached like a man on fire. Everything about it was terrific. So we loved it.
Thanks for coming, man. My wife remembers that too. Whenever I say I'm on the phone with Tim or I'm talking to Tim, she's like, the guy that came and visited with his family. I was like, yeah. And you are not by any stretch the only white family that's ever visited our church, but she remembers you and she remembers the girl. So, yeah.
I tell you, we were super blessed by it. It was really fabulous. So, yeah, man. Well, hey, thank you for taking some time and having this conversation with me and letting our church over here. Totally appreciate that.
Absolutely, man.
let me tell you what. Let me throw out a question for you, and then sit back and listen. So this is super broad, so you can take it wherever you want. But I'd love if you would just talk a little bit about your experience as a man with dark skin in society and in the church.
Yeah. I don't want to start too far back, but just to give some context, my mother and father were not married, but they had me when they were in the Air Force. So I was born at Travis Air Force Base up in Northern Cal. And so right away, my mom moved to down to LA. She's originally from Mississippi. My dad's family is from Louisiana. But she moved to LA right away. And so LA is my home. That's all I've known as far as a home. I grew up in South LA. And I remember my mom saying, and for those of you that are familiar with the LA area, my mom still to this day lives in the same spot. She lives like off of Manchester and Western, which is kind of South LA, kind of southwestern LA, really, because she lives just a couple blocks from Inglewood. She lives close to Van Ness. And so I think for me, I understood who I was as a Black man rather early on, because my mother was dead set on making sure that I got, if we were going to be in public school, if I was going to be in public school, she wanted me to be in the best public school she could get me into. And so at the time she was working in Westwood at the federal building. And so I went to Brentwood Elementary School, and then to Paul Revere Junior High School, and to Palisades High School. So you can imagine, I'm aware of my Black skin at a very early age. But it wasn't.
You didn't blend, did you?
No, not in Brentwood. Not, not in Brentwood. But the crazy thing was, early on, as my mom was bringing me to school, of course, as a working single parent, she needed before and after school care, so to speak, and the school didn't really have those programs as much as maybe some of the inner city schools would have had. And so there was a Jewish family, the Schwartz family, Paul and Sheila Schwartz. My mom met them, and they decided that, hey, we'll take Dwight. Dwight can hang out with our son Brian, and before school and after school. And so I had this mixed understanding early on of what it meant to be Black. I didn't understand the cultural nuances of white in American sense and Jewish in American sense. So I just had this white family that they were the most loving, gracious, open people I had ever met. And then there were these obnoxious, racist bastards on the school campus at the same time. So my worldview was just kind of always inundated with just examples of brotherly, familial love that crossed culture, race, ethnicity, and at the same time a very real awareness that when people see me, as W.E.B. Du Bois puts, that I'm constantly viewed through the lens of someone else and what they think my Blackness means, that double consciousness. So growing up in South LA, I think what really got me, and when I really became aware that there was a really separate system and a separate standard, was again, and I encourage any of your members that can Google Maps to just map out Manchester and Van Ness, and you'll see that it's right on the border of Inglewood. As a matter of fact, the community college that I went to up the street from my mom's house is called Southwest College, because it's in the southwest region of LA. But I remember whenever there was gang violence, whenever there was crime in the neighborhood specifically that I lived in or very near, the news media would always say South Central Los Angeles. And so it wasn't until I think I was probably in my 20s that I realized that I didn't grow up in South Central Los Angeles. I had gone around telling people that I grew up in South Central LA. because that's what the media said. And the power of being able to name me, to be able to categorize me, because I was Black, was just something that really settled in as I got older. And even now, I'm still kind of dealing with what that means. Um, Growing up as a kid and as a young adult, there was just different standards for me than there were for others. My teachers in elementary school and junior high school, not so much so in high school, but in elementary and junior high specifically. I was one of only a handful of Black kids, and I was in gifted programs, GATE programs. So I was one of only a few Black kids in the classes that I was in. And if I did anything wrong, it was pointed out immediately. And I remember my second grade teacher, I will not call her first and last name, although I really want to. I will not call her first and last name. But I was just second grade. I think most kids in second grade, especially probably little boys, are just running around, on drugs and speed and everything. And so I'm just bouncing off the walls just like everybody else. But I just remember this teacher just kept isolating me, and I was doing things that everybody else was doing, but my name kept getting called. And I just couldn't, in second grade, I don't know how to articulate that my white teacher is singling me out because of my race. And it wasn't until my mother, by the end of the semester, by the end of the school year, she had made so many trips to the school because I kept getting in trouble. She finally concluded that, yeah, she said, I figured it out, that teacher she had it out. There were 2 Black kids in her entire classroom. And if you ask me, we were probably one of the first group of Black kids she had ever had. So it was just really kind of painful knowing that through no fault of my own, I was just getting this extra attention, this extra whatever. Then growing up, I lived through the '92 riots. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. But where my mom's house is, from my bedroom window, I could see businesses in flames from my bedroom window. There used to be a Foot Locker outlet and it was a kid store back in the day. I can't remember what it was called, but it was like this strip mall had 3 stores. One of them was a kid store, one was a Foot Locker, and one was something else. Kids Mart. It was a Kids Mart. And I remember going to bed and seeing those stores go up in flames. And so living through the Black Korean store owners and Black community members, that was something I was very, very aware of, that when we would walk into stores, that Korean store owners would follow us around. The shooting of Latasha Harlins over orange juice, watching a video of this Black girl walking out of the store and being shot in her back and killed. And then to hear the white judge say, even though the jury found the store owner guilty, to hear the white judge say, I know a killer when I see one, and this woman's not a killer, and gave her community service.
Wow. Wow.
It was things like that. I won't go into too much depth, but my first ticket that I ever received was Torrance PD. So I've been on the infamous end of Inglewood PD, LAPD, and Torrance PD. Tim, I would dare say that I'm probably not the scariest looking guy you know. I'm just going to go out on a limb here. I'm probably not the most intimidating guy you know, by any stretch of the imagination. But living in Orange County for several years, my wife and I lived in Orange County. I remember going into Sprouts and white and Asian ladies clutching their purses, moving their baskets over. And I'm just looking at myself, and I'm looking at my grass-fed bison in the cart, and I'm like, what about me looks like I would snatch your purse in the middle of Sprouts with grass-fed steaks in my basket. But just, repeatedly just being reminded throughout life that no matter what I do, no matter where I live, no matter what I drive, no matter what I'm wearing, that I'm always different. My wife and I were driving through Long Beach one day, coming from church. The time she had a Mercedes, and we were driving in Long Beach, and we had just come from a church. We were dressed in suit and tie, Sunday best clothing. And Long Beach PD pulls us over with his hand on his gun unholstered for a traffic stop. And we're sitting in the car looking like pastor and first lady, somebody from a anniversary service, and never did give us a ticket, never did nothing like that. And so it's little stuff like that, man, that I've just experienced repeatedly throughout my life. I remember once my car broke down on Crenshaw in Inglewood or LA, because that's kind of the border depending on where you are, pulled up behind me with lights and sirens and guns drawn. And I'm sitting in a car that stalled out with my hazard lights on. But, it's just, there is something about my Black skin, as I've said in some other interviews, this weaponization of Blackness that automatically tells people, it tells people of different ethnicities and cultures, it tells our law enforcement, it tells our justice system, it tells our medical system that if someone is Black, that they can endure more pain, that they are inherently dangerous, that they are necessarily violent people. It's just really, man, disheartening as I listened for the last 10 years repeatedly and have witnessed body after body murdered on social media. It does something to a person. Now, for years, to know that you've been treated less than, and then to see it play out on the big screen, as it were, of reality television and social media, and to hear people argue about whether or not that person was right or wrong, and no one's really able to enter into the conversation of this is just wrong. The gentleman that was shot in Oklahoma City, I believe it was a white police officer that fired the first or fatal shot. When they played the video footage, the body cam and the radio traffic and all of that stuff, the helicopter pilot saw the gentleman get out of his car, and he, from his helicopter, says, and I quote, "This looks like a bad dude." Now, I'd like to know what you can see from a helicopter that makes you think this person is a bad dude the moment they step out of their car, other than the Blackness of their skin. And what complicates things, Tim, is that a lot of people don't know, but I served as a sheriff's deputy for 5 years. I was in law enforcement.
Right.
My wife served for 10 years before injuring her back. So I have this unique perspective that is kind of this insider outsider. I think Brian Laritz talks about that insider outsider thing. But to see some of these incidents, there was a gentleman, I believe it was in South Carolina, that was shot, older Black man, that was shot in his back by the officer as he was fleeing, and somebody's cell phone caught it and submitted it later. But in his police report, he said that the suspect struggled with him and fought for his gun, and so he was in fear for his life and shot him. Now, you don't have to be a CSI addict like my mother is, Law and Order addict like my mother is, to know that if somebody is shot in their back, the entry wound and the exit wound are going to look extremely different. And what person in their right mind, if we're struggling over a firearm, how do I reach around you, shoot you in your back towards me? There was just so much that about the story that just didn't make sense. But because it was a white officer, saying this is what happened, and it was a black suspect. Nobody said anything until the cell phone footage came out. It's just things like this repeatedly. We're looking at so much that's happening in the media right now. And again, if there weren't repeated video after video after video after video after video, if that evidence just wasn't so heavy and if there wasn't just so much of it, it would allow people to not have the conversations that we see taking place now. But I think that the conversations that we see taking place now are only taking place because we don't and have not believed the narrative of our Black brothers and sisters up until now. I'll say two more things and then I'll let you kind of jump in, man. I was watching this documentary. I don't necessarily recommend the documentary because of the excessive amount of profanity that's in the documentary. But there's this rapper named Killer Mike, and he's kind of known in the Atlanta, Georgia area as being an activist. And so he does this documentary, kind of almost like a W. Kamau Bell's Shades of America kind of deal from his perspective. And so he says, I want to, jokingly, he says, I want to expand my rap career. And so I'm looking into expanding, and I want to get a new audience, and I want the white senior audience. That's what I want. So he decides he's going to put on this gangster rap show at a nursing home full of primarily white senior citizens. Yeah. Yeah, it goes bad.
I may have to watch this. In spite of the warning, I might have to watch this.
It's on Netflix. It's called Killer Mike's. I can't remember, but it'll come up. But the smart thing is he opens it up with a barbershop quartet. So he's got this gangster rap song, right? But he's got a barbershop quartet that sings the hook to the song first, and everybody's kind of dancing along to the barbershop quartet until they start cursing and going on. And then he comes out and raps, and it's just crazy. But afterwards, he gets a chance to sit down with some of the residents of the senior housing facility. And he sits down with this older white lady. And he says to her, what do you think about, injustice and the killing of Black people? This is paraphrasing what his question is. And this woman says, this is not scripted. This woman says, well, it wouldn't be so bad if the Black people didn't commit most of the crimes. And I think to myself, what worlds has this woman been birthed into, raised in, and come into contact with that she could, in the last stages of her life, hold a vehement position that less than 12% of the population of this nation commits the majority of the crime. And she argued with him back and forth. And that to me is what we're up against. The fact that being Black has been so weaponized that people do believe Black people are just more violent. You've got to treat them different. You got to look at them different. Tim, this is 2020 and we are 40, 60 years we're supposedly removed from the Civil Rights Act. When I leave this house at night, we live in a relatively safe neighborhood. If I leave to go to the store and it's dark and I go down to the nearest grocery store, if I'm gone for more than 15 minutes, my wife is pulling up the location on my phone and she's calling me. And it's not because she thinks I'm out cheating. It's because she knows that it's very possible that I can leave the house and have one run-in with the police and not make it home alive. The reality of my existence is that if you and I are driving somewhere and the police stop both of us, you're ticked off because, man, you might get a ticket, or this is kind of throwing a wrench in your day. I'm literally thinking this could be the last moment of my life. And that's someone, my registration is paid, my tags are current, I've got insurance, my license, everything is taken care of. But I still, my heart starts racing. I'm wondering whether or not, do I go Facebook Live? Do I video my family? Because I don't know for a fact that I'll make it away from that stop alive. That's, I mean, kind of a random spiel there. I've kind of gone a lot of places, but yeah, man, that's what it feels like.
Yeah. Well, and thank you for that, brother.
Yeah.
You know, talking about kind of the different way that maybe me as a white guy, you as a black guy, would perceive an encounter with the police, the different thoughts we have in our heads. And you mentioned Torrance, and you know, when I first moved here, moved to the South Bay, gosh, 20 plus years now. You know, at the time I had taken a job at a church in a neighboring city. I was a staff pastor there, and somebody from the search committee was kind of taking us around town and trying to help us decide where to find a place to rent, right? And and they lived in Torrance, and they brought us into Torrance and said, you got to choose Torrance. You know, we didn't have kids yet, but they're like, the schools are great, and our police department is great. Everybody in Torrance loves Torrance PD. And I was like, oh, how come? And the person kind of thought about it for a moment and said, well, Torrance PD kind of knows who lives here and who doesn't. And if you don't live here, they, you know, they're going to want to know what you're doing. And me 20 years ago, I didn't really understand what that meant.
Yeah.
I heard it and was like, oh, you know, okay, it's a safe city. But I mean, I've had enough friends, people of color, especially those who are black. Torrance is only 3% black, who they understand that statement in a much different way.
Absolutely.
And it's their ears a lot differently than it did mine 20 years ago.
Yeah. And that thing of racial profiling, it's such a real thing, man. I wish I could peel back, you know, I wish I could get a drill and just peel back people's skull and pour, you know, just pour a hole of experience, you know, pour a tube of experience into your head. It is something else to feel as though you are hunted, to feel as though you're fair game for anyone who wants to claim they're protecting themselves, for law enforcement, for the justice system. You know, we're looking at I think Louisville, just one of the cities just killed their the no-knock warrant process, saying that from now on we're not going to use the no-knock warrant process. But let me, what'd you say? Oh,
Nothing. Go ahead.
yeah. So here's let's talk about just that policy for a second, right? So it's great that we're going to disband that procedure, that one process. But here's the problem. The problem is that the no-knock warrant, and the reason why they rescinded it and removed it, was because it was being used overwhelmingly on just black homes, black families. It was the Black families that they deemed were more violent and more dangerous. So they needed this permission to go in without identifying themselves. So here's the problem. Taking away that process doesn't remove the fact that you have officers serving on the police force who felt it was necessary and justified to go after this procedure because of because of the danger they perceived would be meeting them. That doesn't eliminate the judges or the supervisors at the police department that signed off on this, or the judges that also agreed with them. So removing the policy is one thing, but there are so many layers to where this weaponization of Blackness, it's so prevalent at so many layers that it's like, damn, how do you get away from that? How do you, removing one rule or one law or getting a civil rights bill is great. I mean, I've been watching a bunch of documentaries. Like, it's great that we get the Civil Rights Act, right, in '64. It's great, but the person who 2 weeks before the bill was signed was throwing bricks at Black bodies, that was walking into lunch counters and kicking a Black man and a Black woman and dragging them out of that counter. What does the signing of that legislation do 2 weeks later?
Right.
That person is still there. And so I love that we have these conversations, and I love that things are happening. I do have hope that things are happening. But I think that sometimes we're not aware of the size and the scale and the magnitude of the issue that we're dealing with. It's not just a bad cop here. It's not just a bad rule there. There is something there, not just something. There is a remnant from the racialization and categorization of human bodies. That remnant, we live in the fruit of that tree. That the moment European colonial colonizers say, hey, white is going to be great, and shades of white are okay, but when you get down to this Black thing, that's horrible. It's animalistic. It's dehuman. The fact that they would look at Black women's bodies and judge their hips and their breasts and their behinds and decide whether or not they were good for child rearing. That they would look at Black men and decide by the broadness of their shoulders whether or not they could do the manual labor. That system, as antiquated as we think it is, we are still eating from the fruit of that tree. So that when my wife goes into the doctor, her non-Black doctor that goes to do her mammogram doesn't understand, as a white woman in most cases, or sometimes an Asian woman in most cases, doesn't understand that Black and brown women, that their breast tissue tends to be fattier. It tends to have more fat in the breast tissue. So when they look at these x-rays, they judge them based on the white normative practices. So if I could go call half of the women in our church right now, and they would all tell you about breast cancer or mammogram scares that they've had at the doctor, simply because the doctor didn't understand that there was some cultural and anatomical difference. And we're still dealing with that. So, I mean, the problem, man, just becomes this massive thing that it almost feels like, just to hell with it. There's nothing I can do about it. Save the hope of Jesus Christ. But I just want to make sure that we're naming that it's not just me. It's not just that Tim doesn't like me because I'm Black. It's larger than this. We've built an entire way of being based on a system that looks at me and says something about me before I ever get to open my mouth. And that's horrible, and it's problematic. And it's the reason why Dr. Joy DeGruy's book, Post-Traumatic Slave Disorder, she's talking about how Black people are carrying trauma literally in their bodies, because it's something about every time I walk out of the house. I live in a predominantly white neighborhood. Every time I walk out of the house, I'm consciously aware of how somebody else sees me and how I see myself. I never get to W.E.B. Du Bois says, I never get to develop my own value of myself based on myself. The way I have to determine my value, my self-worth, is based on other people's view of me. And that's the difference between a Black child and a white child in America, that the white child can decide to be anything that they want to be. And there's images of that all around them that confirm that. And the Black child has to ask, will they ever let me be that? And that's the heart of, man, that just, it's, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, man. Well, there's like 16 things that you said inside of this that I want to come back to, but no. I mean, there's just so much, Dwight, you're saying that I think is so important, and I so appreciate. That experience piece you mentioned. I'm going to misquote you, but you said it would be something to the effect it would be really awesome if we could just like drill into somebody's head and like dump a bunch of experience in there, because, and I think that's part of what I appreciate so much about our friendship and about you being willing to do this with me and with our church too, is because that's not part of my experience. I think for me, at least, the closest I ever get to that is hearing friends talk about it. And that's not because I'm ignorant either. I read the books, I watch the movies. I grew up in a house that was anti-racist. It's not like that aspect is new to me, but I think because it's not part of my experience,
right,
it's just different. It's different when I'm sitting at table with a friend and I'm hearing about these things. And
right.
I guess I'm saying I'm longing for that same thing, for more of us who are not Black to be able to get some of that experience dumped into us, because it changes me. 20 years ago, I didn't hear that statement about Torrance PD the way that I hear it now. And I should say too, I mean, I have friends in the department, and I actually really like our police force, but I know that reputation is real. And anyway, I mean, outside of the kind of experiences that you're relating, you just don't hear that stuff. It kind of blows past you. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Because it's not your experience. So let's take it away from just the quote unquote Black white binary for a minute. I have daughters. I've got 2 girls, and as much as I try to be an advocate for my girls, in my work, in the things that I do, I try to make sure that I'm bringing in women's perspectives, not just feminism, but womanism also, women of color. I try to bring those things in my preaching. I'm much more, if I use your wording, 20 years ago versus now, I'm much more conscious of women's issues today, specifically with theology in the church, than I was 20 years ago. But I still don't have the experience. I don't know what it means to walk in a pulpit and have people look at me because I'm a woman and question whether or not I can preach or whether or not I should be in that place. I don't have that experience. So, I mean, you're right. It's part of the problem is that when we don't have an experience, and when we don't have sources that can fill in that gap for us, it leaves us experientially ignorant. And not that we're bad people, not that we're not trying, not that we don't want to be advocates or allies, but experientially we're missing a piece. And so, Howard Thurman, in Jesus and the Disinherited, he says that one of the things that hatred needs to thrive and to survive is contact without fellowship, meaning that
Mm.
people who are different, they bump into each other in life, but there's no fellowship, there's no intimacy, there's no relationship, there's no communication. And so what happens is, as long as we are, Tim is over there and Dwight's over here, and we bump into each other at Fuller and in these different circles, but we never sit down and break bread together. You never invite me to the gatekeepers. You don't come to my church. As long as we don't do that stuff, then we've got contact where we're forced to deal with each other, but we have no fellowship. And without fellowship, you can't hear the narrative of my life. I can't hear the narrative of your life. And so the areas where I'm experientially ignorant or void, my fellowship with you, my relationship with you helps to fill in that void. So even though it might not be my story, I'm advocating for you on behalf of that because I've heard your story. And so I'm a movie person. I do pop culture. It's my thesis, my dissertation. It's the way my brain is wired. So the movie Crash, right, years ago. If you remember the monologue of Crash, the Crash is about the city of Los Angeles, and in the monologue he says that we live in these cities, in this city, and we live behind glass and behind steel. That we get in our car, we leave our house, we get in our garage, in our car, we go to where we're going, we get out of the car, and he says that in the monologue that we long, though, for human touch and contact so badly, and we deprive ourselves of it, that we crash into each other. And that's the premise of the movie. And all through the movie, there are these narratives of these lives that are seemingly completely disconnected from each other. And at the end of the movie, you see that they were always interconnected, right? And I feel like that's what Thurman is saying, that we've got to find ways of making our lives connect with one another apart from crashing into each other over our political affiliations, over what we think should happen, over our social media blasts, our Twitter feeds. We've got to find ways of actually having human interaction, contact, and fellowship with each other if we've got a snowball's chance in hell of defeating hate.
Man. Oh, I love it. That is so well put. Contact with that fellowship. And I think, okay, let me try a thought. Tell me if you think this is right. But
Go for it.
I feel like that's especially true. It's especially important when it comes to, I'll say, sort of maybe the more subtle dimensions of race. Like another thing you said a minute ago that's kind of an example of this for me is, again, I'm paraphrasing you, but you were saying the problem is more than just a racist cop, right?
Yeah.
Like that's a problem. But beyond that, there's kind of this more subtle dimension of there's a lot of folks who maybe don't harbor sort of an active animosity, but they're carrying around some biases about what it means to be Black that get baked into the pie at different levels, where
Absolutely.
you end up with a policy that, is it a racist policy? Not necessarily, but you add this assumption in, and it can become very dangerous. And does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
I feel like maybe those subtleties are where we get tripped up a little bit when we don't have that experiential piece between us, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I think outside of that, it's easy to look at something, George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery or any of these and look and go, oh, well, it's kind of an isolated thing. And you feel that way because you check your own heart and you're like, oh, that's horrible. It's awful. But you're not able to connect it to the larger picture outside of that fellowship, outside of that experiential knowing of somebody else's life and their story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does that make sense? Is there anything to that?
Yeah. Because I think part of the problem with us having large scale conversations around race is that we have we have I don't want to sound condescending. We're having very ill-informed conversations. And what I mean by that is this. We're still arguing about whether or not racism is personal or systemic. Like, that's an actual argument. And because we don't really understand the difference between a prejudice and a bias and implicit bias, and then racism, which always deals with a level of power, because we don't agree or we don't know, the differences between these. For me to so let me try to tie this in a little bit. And if I take too long, just let me know, man. You can edit this out.
Okay.
So I did a training for the California Department of Rehabilitation for their employees. And so I use it as building blocks, right? Prejudice says that I don't have an actual narrative or an experience with this group, but I believe what somebody else has told me about that group. So I've never met a white guy before. So whatever the media tells me about white people, that's what I'll believe. So now, because I have yeah, right. So now, because I have this prejudice that all black people like watermelon and all white people don't season their food, right? These prejudices, right? That these are the things that people have told me, right? So now I move to a bias. So now, because I have this prejudice, I now make a decision about who I like and don't like, and who I will do for and won't do for, based on the prejudice that's already here. So now I decide, if I look at two resumes, and one of them is Timothy and one of them is Jamal, I've been told that black people don't like to work hard. So the resume that says Jamal, I've got a prejudice against this group, and my bias is that I would rather lean towards the white person or the white sounding name than the black sounding name, because I have a prejudice, and now I've developed a preference. Now my preference, my bias moves me to action, and my action based on my power, my proximity to power, my access to power, leads to the systemic issue that we have. So because we say that black people are violent, that's the prejudice, then the bias is that we've got to treat them differently. So then the systemic racism comes in, where if you're caught with an ounce of powdered cocaine versus an ounce of crack cocaine, if you get powdered cocaine, you get probation, you get a slap on the wrist, and you get, in a 2 or 3 years, you get the opportunity to file for that to come off. If you get caught with crack cocaine, you're doing either the maximum county time, or you're getting a federal, or you're getting a state prison sentence. So the difference is that because we've said crack cocaine is a more violent drug, it is surrounded by more violence. Well, duh. You took cocaine, this very addictive drug that people who have money can afford. You've boiled it down now to a place where it's now $5, $10, $15, and you've dropped it off in urban communities. Yeah, there's going to be violence around it, because people that can't afford to eat are now killing each other to try to get high, whereas people who are doing cocaine can afford their drug. It's the layers that I think I think that's what I hear you saying. Like we're good maybe at talking about one level, but there's a whole nother level that we don't do well at talking about. So we can talk about, yeah, it's not right that women make less money than men on the dollar, right? That's a systems problem. But are we really ready to deal with the fact that there is still an inherent thought that women don't work as hard as men? If we keep it with race, we got systemic race. It's bad. Yeah, George Floyd's killers should be brought to justice. But are we going to deal with the training that tells that cop that black person is inherently more violent, even though he may or may not have known about a counterfeit bill? But the fact that you've got to stay on his neck for so long because there's something about his blackness that makes him more violent. Eric Garner. Why do we have to jump up and choke him first? Why is that our first move, to jump up and choke his life out? I think that's what to me, that's what I kind of hear you trying to nuance, that there's the one conversation here, but then there's the smaller stuff that we're not talking about. I've heard people talk about, we need systems change and heart change in that way. But I just think, like you said, I think there's the layers to the conversation that really need to be had. And we need to talk about systems, but we need to talk about also just how I gravitate towards certain people. I feel safer with certain groups.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's all connected, and I love the way you break that down. That was just, gosh, it's so well put. And I think the thought that I keep coming back to today is I don't know that we'll be able to approach this with that level of I don't know if subtlety is the right word, but to approach each layer of this that you're describing outside of a personal relationship, outside of contact that gets all the way to fellowship, because I think otherwise, and I'm thinking like of the systemic piece, just to be like kind of bluntly candid, I think for a lot of us as white people, we don't really have a category for it. And I think that's probably because more often than not, the system works for us. And so even conceptually, it's a little difficult to get there. And I think, again, that's where the experiential piece is helpful. It might not be my experience, but the fact that you're willing to talk with me about your experience, and then we know each other, and I already, I could watch a similar conversation on YouTube probably, but it wouldn't mean the same thing to me because I know you and I met your daughters, and, we've laughed together over stupid things and, theological humor. Who does that? Pastors and seminary professors. It makes no sense. But, let me ask you this. Because I'm sure I need to let you go here, but I'd love to know just any kind of suggestions, best practices, for somebody like me, for a church like ours, for your white brothers and sisters and your non-Black people of color brothers and sisters that are hanging out at Life Covenant Church, and for that matter, the Black brothers and sisters that are with us too. But what are your suggestions for those of us who are wanting to grow?
Yeah, let me say first, I think it's important when we have these kinds of conversations, that the person in my seat just kind of makes the disclaimer that by no way can any one person, 5 people, 10 people, 20 people, speak on the experience of every person in any group. That we're not, Black culture is not monolithic. Black Christianity is not monolithic. But I think that, as you've probably discovered, and as your church has probably discovered, the more you start hearing similarities in narrative after narrative, you have to start saying there's something there. The old adage, where there's smoke, there's fire, right? So here, I've tried to give a passionate, heartfelt testimonies and story and narrative. And here's where I've just completely run off the rails, and I go to a comedy movie. There was an old comedy movie. I think it was in the, I want to say it was in the 90s, Harlem Nights. And at the time, it had every Black comedian who was somebody was in that movie. Della Reese, Red Fox, Eddie Murphy, Arsenio Hall. Charlie Murphy. Everybody was in Tommy Ford. Everybody was in this movie, right? And so for me, fast forward to the very end of the movie. The movie's hilarious. I could literally, when we finish this, I could literally go grab some popcorn, sit down and watch that movie again right now. It was that funny to me, right? But at the end of the movie, and for those that have never seen the movie is basically Eddie Murphy and Richard Pryor. Well, Richard Pryor kind of runs this speakeasy, this underground, juke joint casino, and the mob boss wants his cut of the action because he finds out that the black people are making way more money than they should be making. And so he sends, the cops on his payroll to go do whatever. And I believe it's Danny Aiello plays the detective. And the detective is kind of messing with him and doing stuff to him. And at the end of the movie, they hatched this plan to get rich and get out. And I think that's a good paraphrase, right? And so at the end of the movie, they lure Danny Aiello into this closed down bank, this abandoned bank. And they turn the tables on him and they tie him up and they put him in, they're about to close the vault. They're about to leave him in this vault. And they tell him, listen, it's Friday night or Saturday night, whatever. They said, you've got enough air for 2 days. And on Monday morning, we'll call the precinct, let them know where you are. You should be fine. And Danny Aiello is like, he's cussing like, who the hell is, how do you know how much air is in here? And they turn to Charlie Murphy, rest his soul. And Charlie Murphy, who doesn't look like an accountant, a mathematician at all. He's just like, yeah, I did the math. It's about right, give or take an hour. and everybody's in the theater, right, or at home, we're just cracking up. And Eddie Murphy says this iconic line that in Black culture, this is an iconic line. Eddie Murphy turns to Danny Aiello and said, yeah, you should be good, give or take an hour. He said, but I'll tell you what you do. Just take small breaths. And that's what he tells them. And they close the vault door. And if you've seen the movie, everybody's laughing. And then the camera zooms in on Danny Aiello, and he's sitting there and he's running through his head, this Italian police officer, this white guy with power, with prestige, with power, with privilege. He's got money, he's got in with the police department and with the mob bosses. He's sitting there in the midst of all of this power, and how dare these black gangsters just tell him what to do and whatever. And then you can see it on his face. He turns and he thinks about it. Without saying a word, he says, what if they're telling the truth? And again, this comedic moment, Danny Aiello goes, because in that moment, as much as we're laughing, Danny has said this, I don't believe that they know what they're talking about. I don't believe that they're telling me the truth. There's nothing in my narrative, and I'm preaching right now. There's nothing in my narrative or in my experience that tells me I should trust anything these people are telling me. But what if they're telling the truth? And for me, what I would want my non-Black sisters and brothers to do is to put yourself in Danny Aiello's seat. And I know that it's hard to hear that. It's hard to hear when people talk critically about the country that we love. And for me, one of the reasons I criticize America so harsh is because I love it, and because I believe that it can live into what it was supposed to be. And so I know it's hard to hear people criticize some of our leaders, some of our icons and legends, to hear people criticize our faith, to hear people criticize our systems that we trust. And like you said, to use your words, Tim, and the system pretty much works for you. But what if those people are telling the truth? And what if you, just for a couple of days, adjusted your way of being in the world to understand, to hear, and to say that maybe they're telling the truth? And I think as we are hearing protests around George Floyd, and it's a remix of what we said with Eric Garner, I can't breathe. What if your Black brothers and sisters are telling you, yes, this is a great place, but there's things in this place that are literally robbing me of the air in the room. And instead of mocking me, instead of just dismissing me in hand, what if you for a moment just believed me and adjusted your way of being in the world? I think that for me is my advice for my non-Black sisters and brothers, that they would just hear me and say, what if he's telling the truth? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, bro.
That is, it's simple and it's profound. I thank you for it.
I hope so. I hope so. It's gonna make me gonna watch Harlem Nights tonight.
Walk around going for the rest of the day.
Yeah.
Well, brother, I'm so thankful for you taking the time to do this. It's a blessing to me. It's a blessing to our
Absolutely.
church. Yeah, you're a blessing, brother.
Absolutely, man. And when Tim asks you to do something, it's like you got to jump in. You got to help. It's Tim. It's Tim.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that.
Absolutely, brother. Blessings.
All right, my friend. Well, hey, I'd say we'll see you at school, but eventually we'll see you at school when we're
online.
Back on the campus. Yes, exactly. We'll see you online. All right, brother. So you right said hi.
I will. Give my love to the family, man. Blessings.
Will do, man. See you, brother.
Later.